Okay, this is a short video on convolution. And the neuron. Generally, this block is based on two facts. The first one being that the way we as human beings perceive similarity is based on the convolution operation, which was presented in another video. And the short fact that our brain consists of neurons and the interconnections between neurons, which are responsible in the event for intelligence and for our capacity to solve problems and find our way around in this world. Okay, so to repeat, the convolution operation is defined as taking some inputs x and y. These are vectors, so we take the elements and multiply them piece by piece, sum them up over all the dimensions of the vector, and maybe normalize it over some length of the vector or something. Okay, and this, as we said, is a similarity operation. Sometimes we denote it as positive convolution with this convolution operator that might be familiar from the world of signal processing. As I said, there is also a second operation, which is a distance operator, comes along in different forms. Once again, it means summing up over dimensions of two vectors, but this time we do not take the product, but we take the difference, the contrast, again with some normalization. We, for us, denote this as negative convolution in this form, but this is just my personal style of writing. This is nothing confirmed. Whereas, for example, the positive operator is well known and generally affirmed. Okay, now let's have a look at why this is a similarity and the other one being a distance operation. In the first case, we have a multiplication element-wise. Multiplication element-wise means that under the assumption that we have a normalization here, that if x is maximal and y is maximal, that means if they are very similar, then this product will produce a maximum. That is already the essential similarity operation in the whole thing of positive convolution, which is of so fundamental importance, for example, in deep networks and in all sorts of artificial neural networks, and as we will see in a minute, also in natural neural networks. Okay, now, quite unsurprising, if it's a distance operation, we do not compute the product of the two elements, but we have a look at how different they are. The more different they are, the bigger this term is because we take the absolute value. If we sum up big terms, it means that we have a total large dissimilarity here in the end, whereas here we have a similarity operation. Again, both of them are convolution operations in different forms of signal processing applications and processes. You find one time applied the one and another time the other. For example, positive convolution is usually used in machine learning methods, in the classic ones. For example, the support vector machine is based on the inner product on positive convolution, whereas there is a tendency in the area of signal processing, in particular when it comes to audio processing and statistical data analysis, to work with the distance function. This, by the way, is the L1 norm, the so-called Manhattan metric or city block distance, or the Minkowski distance of first order, and there are a few other names also. In the world of signal processing, you usually have this form. Okay, doesn't make much difference as long as you employ a generalization operation, but that we had already in another block. Now that we know that this is fundamentally how, as human beings, we measure similarity. The question is, what happens in the brain? Well, that is also well known. In the neural network in the brain, the fundamental building block is the nerve cell. The nerve cell comes along usually with several inputs. These inputs are usually called the synapses. It comes along with an axon and splints up into different dendrites in a tree form ending in synapses. So the connection with the soma here in the center, the connection of two cells, of two nerve cells, goes via the synaptic interconnectors. This is the neuron. Here we have the individual synapse. Okay, the whole tree we said we refer to as the dendrites. Perfect. So, what functions do we have in this element, the neuron? One very important function that we have is we have a weighting function here. The weighting happens in the chemical neurotransmitter process. We won't go into detail about that. You should have read that in the first 7 chapters of the course literature, in particular of Kandel et al. Neuroscience already, that the electrical signal process, propagation process that is used in the neuron, in the individual cell, is converted in the synaptic connections into a chemical transmission of the information, and then on the other hand translated into an electrical propagation. These details from the point of view of information processing are not so important here, so we omit them. As I said, you should have read that already. But the chemical propagation causes an act of weighting down of the input signals, and that is important for us. A second function that we have in the center of the cell, where we are in the nucleus, where we actually have a thresholding function, and only if some potential exceeds some threshold, we actually do this further propagation process, which means an amplification of the signal over individual elements of the axon pathway, but that is also beyond the scope of our small introduction here. Only, as I said, if the threshold is exceeded. Now, what potential do we mean? We mean the sum of the weighted inputs. So we also have a sum operation here, which is very important for the understanding of our function. So to repeat, we have here, obviously, in the central element of the central nervous system, we have an signal propagation algorithm from one neuron to the other. Typically, by the way, two neurons are connected over not just one synapse, but maybe over 100, 200, or even up to 500 connections. So there is a lot of neurotransmitters actually used in order to propagate the signal. So the input is first weighted down and also slowed down by the chemical process, but that is also not in the focus of our lecture here. Secondly, the individual inputs are aggregated, are summed up, and then are compared to some threshold, and only if the threshold is exceeded, we propagate the signal to the dendrites and from there to other nerve cells. So in the event, we come up with a function of, if we call this weights a weight vector W, we come up with a function of the inputs let's denote them as x, as we usually have them, of x and y are folded together, and that means, once again, that the individual elements of the input vector xi are multiplied with the weights. We sum them up, and if that is beyond some threshold, then we propagate a signal. As you can see, that is very similar to what we had before when we spoke about the convolution operator, this one here. We have mostly the same form. The major differences are that here we speak of a weight vector. This weight vector is nothing deliberate. It is actually part of the topology of the individual neuron. That means if a synaptic connection is closer to the center, to the soma, then the weight is higher. If it is further away, then the weight is lower. We do not know at this present time if or how actually it is chosen that two neurons connect closer or further away from the center. It has an impact on the learning, it has an impact on the information that is stored apparently, but we do not understand how it is actually built, if it is done in some deliberate learning form or if it is actually chance. Okay, having said that, there is still the same form of two vectors being compared, one time with the weights, another time with some other input, and certainly these are summed up to form a potential, and only if that is beyond some threshold we have a firing pattern and signal propagation to following neurons, and therefore this is already a small simple form of a classifier. That is, to sum it up, every single simple neuron aggregates inputs, secondly performs a similarity operation, convolution, and thirdly does a simple classification. It's a simple classifier on the level of the individual, in particular interneuron. As we said before, there are three different types of neurons. Basically, there are many different subtypes, of course. One being motor neurons in order to control muscle movement, on the other hand being perceptual receptor cells that provide the input signals, and those in between are referred to as the interneurons. And these interneurons, as we said, sum up the potentials, weight them down, perform a convolution operation, measure the similarity of what is already stored in the cell, we come to that when we speak about memory, and compare that to the input signal, thus measuring similarity, but also already doing a retrieval operation. The memory that is in the weights, stored in the weights, in the topology of the neural network, is actually already retrieved, compared, and if a certain similarity is identified, it is propagated to other classifiers. That means that every single neuron is, as a convoluting cell, already one step in semantic enrichment of the input signal. That means the output of the neuron is on a higher level. It is not just the naive input, but it is the input in relation to what, as weights, the cell already stores as knowledge that the cell learned before from the nature that it has been exposed to. As we said, we don't exactly know how it works. Now consider, we have 10 by the power of 10 cells. And these cells are connected by 10 by the power of 13 connections. That is a lot, apparently. It means that on the cubic millimeter we have roughly 10,000 cells, making it 10 million connections. Therefore, even though the individual operation of one neuron is very simple, the whole process is very, very complex and creates a long, long chain of semantic enrichment where the input signal, originally from some perceptor cell, is converted over steps and steps and layers and so-called pathways into an understanding of our environment, plus into output in muscle movement in order to create speech, movement, and many other forms of reactions that we can do. So that's it for the neuron for now. We come back to that later when we speak about the tiers of neural networks.